Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, June the 3rd, 2021. Today is my name day. It is the feast of Kevin of Glendalough in Ireland. And what do we know about this saint? Well, apparently he lived a very long time, from 498 AD to 618. He was an Irish monk, a hermit, and he is said to have been much beloved by animals and much pursued by women. He is typically shown with a blackbird in his hand, which follows from a famous story about him, which was immortalized in poetry by Seamus Heaney, which I'll read to you now. The poem is called St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on out, down through his hurting forearms? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of underneath crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labor and not to seek reward, he prays, a prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank forgotten the river's name. Charming story, don't you think? Of course, this is not only the Feast of St. Kevin, it is Pride Month, and it is Pride Month all the time. Every single thing in the world has a rainbow stamped on it, and also the trans variation on the rainbow, and the black gay variation on the rainbow. It's hard to keep up with the symbolism of the alphabet people. William Briggs wrote yesterday on his website, wmbriggs.com, highly recommended. Pro-non-reproductive sex-like activities groups say Poland has most based European church. Finland, and by a wide margin, officially has the most debased Christian church. It's called the Metropolitan Community Church in Finland. The numbers are a crude estimate, but about 3,000 souls, lost or not, are its members. Poland's Roman Catholic Church is the most based, easily beating out its competitors. It has 33 million souls in an ecumenical spirit. Let's all give them a clap offering. This is a real thing in evangelical circles. The Roman Catholic Church in Belarus, it has to be admitted, gave Poland a bit of a scare, but in the end, they came in second most based. They have 600,000 souls. So says Rice 2020, the Rainbow Index of churches in Europe. They had to go at quantifying the unquantifiable status of how much different official self-identifying Europe Christian churches embrace non-procreative sex-like activities. You have to hand it to these guys that put a lot of time and effort into their rankings. What they did was to award each church a certain points along several dimensions. Various questions were asked and a large number of status checks were performed, such as whether each church's legal documents mention alphabet people identities in a non-negative way. Juiciest ones, under theology, the Bible is not used as a normative instrument for defining gender roles and is not interpreted as a condemnation of alphabet people, nor of alphabet people lived desires, sexualities, and identities. They might have got this one from Anton LaVey. Under church policy, the church officiates same-sex marriages and or holds a blessing ceremony for same-sex couples. Discrimination against thruples and higher dimensions is still a thing for these bigots. Under ordination of clergy, The church ordains people regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Most of them still discriminate against age, allowing no children to be ordained, the bigots. Under sexuality and kinship, the church supports the adoption and raising of children by alphabet people couples. Under worship, gender issues and sexuality are thematized in public worship on the national level of the church. In the Catholic Church, we call these both clown and barefoot dance masses. There are 47 of these things. Each is awarded a full or half point, and the whole is summed. The Finnish church garnered 45.5 points, almost an imperfect score, whereas the Polish church got a 1, almost a perfect score. The Poles got 2 half points, both under church policy. The church baptizes children of all parents of all sexual orientations and gender identities, and the church doesn't make any restriction to participating in the Eucharist communion based on gender and or sexual identity. This is accurate and a fair assessment, since the traditional reading, making every allowance for exceptions, would say all comers should be baptized and all sinners, even lawyers, be welcomed in some sense. It could be argued a perfect score is 1. Some of you will wonder how the Church of Sweden didn't finish as most debased, given that Sweden has aptly been described as hell on earth. Well, as Rice says, 98% of Swedes say LGB, no T or I, should have the same rights as non-LGB people. Some 95% say there's nothing wrong with same-sex relationship, and they let people who believe they are not the sex they are to change paperwork which agrees with their delusions. They came close, snatching second place at 41.5 points, and at 6 million members to the Finnish church's paltry 3,000. This can't be seen as other than a tremendous victory for the Church of Sweden Lutheran. There are no surprises about who follows close behind. Protestant Church of Switzerland, score of 38.5, Church of Norway, 36.5, and rounding out the bottom 5 most debased, Protestant Church in the Netherlands, 36. We saw the top 2 based churches. Taking third place was the Russian Orthodox Church, score of 2.5, Armenian Apostolic Church, 3, and tying for 5th place with 3.5 points each, Evangelical Lutheran Church of Latvia and Georgian Orthodox Church. William Briggs concludes, it has to be said, the East beat the hell out of themselves. As you may remember, after Major League Baseball decided that it was pulling its all-star game from Atlanta, Georgia, because of a voter integrity law passed there, I decided I was done with baseball, at least until it gets unwoke. Well, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. MLB has decided to go full woke and is working as hard as it can to alienate its traditional supporters. This is from Warner Todd Houston at Breitbart. The San Francisco Giants told fans Tuesday that the team will add gay pride colors to its hats and uniforms in recognition of Gay Pride Month. Quote, the 11 colors of the new Pride logo are emblematic of the Progress Pride flag and signify inclusion and progression with the 6 Pride colors, the team said in a statement: red, life; orange, healing; yellow, sunlight; green, nature; blue, serenity; purple, spirit; and black and brown to recognize alphabet people of color, and light blue, pink, and white to recognize people who are transgender. ESPN reported that the league intends to join the team to introduce the new designs. Billy Beane, MLB's first ambassador for inclusion, will take part in Saturday's events at Oracle Park, where the palm trees in Willie Mays Plaza will be wrapped in the 11 colors of the Pride flag. The Oracle Park scoreboard will also display Pride colors throughout June. Giants manager Gabe Kapler added that he is, quote, very proud that the San Francisco Giants are taking this step, very proud to be a part of it, and looking forward to the impact and the support that we can provide for the alphabet people community. Giants president and CEO Larry Baer also added his voice in praise of the idea, saying in a statement, quote, we're extremely proud to stand with the alphabet people community as we kick off one of the best annual celebrations in San Francisco by paying honor to the countless achievements and contributions of all those who identify as alphabet people and are allies of the alphabet people community. Here's something from Jordan Davidson at the Federalist. Biological males who identify as female could be allowed in all women prisons across the country if the Equality Act is passed and signed by President Joe Biden's Democrat administration. No hormones or surgery required. After talking to women already affected by California's radical gender law, which is at risk of becoming national, Abigail Schreier, a journalist and author of Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters, told the Federalist Ben Domenech on Fox News that these women are terrified. They are housed 8 to a cell. The guards do not even have guns. They walk around with batons and pepper sprays because women are less violent and men are already transferring in. There is no requirement. All that a violent male felon needs to do is self-identify as a woman, and he is entitled in the state of California to petition to transfer in. It's astounding to me how you can have this kind of delusion about the differences between people and actually form a policy that can put women at serious risk, Domenech added. What can be done to push back against this? I mean, this seems to be absolutely terrible in terms of what these women could be experiencing in very short order. The answer, Schreier said, is to prevent the Democrats' Equality Act from passing Congress. Remember that this would violate the Geneva Convention if it were done to prisoners of war. Schreier reminded us. It's horrifying, and it's about to become federal law. If the Equality Act passes, it will become federal law in all 50 states. Joe Biden has already indicated that he would sign this bill into law. It's right now in the Senate, and really for the safety and bodily integrity of these women, it really should be stopped. Schreier concluded, I'm worried that we're running out of time. And the reason is right now, in states that allow you to change your birth certificate, and we're already seeing this, we're going to lose track of the men who go into women's prison. They won't need to transfer in from men's prisons anymore. They'll go straight into women's prisons. They will be recorded as women, and their violence against women will be recorded as women on women violence. And remember, the thing to remember is that over half of men who are transgender are heterosexual. When one hears about things like this, one is drawn to the conclusion that the trans movement can be seen as a rather radical reaction to feminism. Yes, we'll show you what's what, cis women. Oh, and Joe Biden. I wonder if there's Joe Biden increasingly reminding me of Murphy and RoboCop, that every so often you hear from him indications that he hasn't completely forgotten the man that he used to be before he started making up whoppers, such as the story that happened in, 1961, 1960, 1959, of Joe and his working class dad being in Wilmington, Delaware, and seeing two men kissing openly in the street. The latest iteration of Joe's Whopper has these two men being black. And working class Joe Sr., when little Joe showed some astonishment, replied, supposedly, ridiculously, of course he didn't. They just love each other, Joey. Yes, every so often Joe Biden blurts out something that is really quite amazing, and everyone pretends not to have heard it. This is from Charlie Spearing at Breitbart. President Biden cited mixed-race couples in advertising as evidence that Americans were growing less racist as a society in a speech on Tuesday. He spoke in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to mark the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Greenwood race riots. Biden cited his hope in future generations, who he said were the best educated and least prejudiced on issues of race. Quote, those of you who were over 50, how often did you ever see advertisements on television with black and white couples? Not a joke. Biden claimed that if you watch television for 2 hours, you would see 2 to 3 out of 5 advertisements representing mixed race couples. That's not by accident, he said. They're selling soap, man, not a joke. Biden cited the late pollster Patrick Cadell, who once said that watching advertising could help anyone understand the current state of American culture. Pat Caddell was absolutely right about that, but not in a sense that Joe Biden understands. Because they want to sell what they have, he said, referring to the corporations. The president previously cited his observation about mixed-race couples in advertising in February during a CNN town hall. Quote, "I'm going to say something that's going to get me in trouble. And that is that, think about it. If you want to know where the American public is, look at the money being spent in advertising," he told Anderson Cooper. Did you ever, 5 years ago, think every second or third ad out of 5 or 6 you turn on would be biracial couples? No, I'm not being facetious. The reason I'm so hopeful is this new generation. They're not like us. They're thinking differently, unquote. So Joe Biden thinks that advertising is somehow the voice of the people, or perhaps even the voice of God. I'm reminded that just a few years ago, Joe Biden made some people rather nervous when he ascribed the victory of gay marriage against seemingly strong odds to the Jews. He said this repeatedly. Yes, it was the Jews. If it wasn't for the Jews, and I'm sure Jews in the audience and Jews who saw this, stumm, okay, Joe, stumm. But as I say, sometimes Joe simply can't help himself. Let's go to the chat. Hello to random number generator, Dionysius, Pitsky, Jogakin 666, Palpicasso 88, Dan. Pitsky says, if I had to guess, I'd say Kevin despises Elton John. Despises? He's a tiresome person. I bought his first record when it came out. And actually, it was his second record, but the first to be released in North America, because everyone was raving about him. And then I bought the second one and the live one and the Friends, is that what it's called? Friends soundtrack. And after that, I sort of drifted away from him and his maudlin songs with the worst lyrics by Bernie Taupin. If you think I'm exaggerating, look at the lyrics for Candle in the Wind. It's just a mixed metaphor gone feral. It's just so embarrassing. But no. Elton John, of course, is the patron saint of pain. He was far ahead of the curve on that one. And he's still around, wearing that ridiculous wig. I recommend the Star Stories episode on Elton John, which is very amusing. It is rather scabrous, so are all the Star Stories episodes, you have been warned. But it's very funny. Hello to our valiant moderator, Chaddson. Thank you for your work. Oh, people are asking about Kevin. Kevin is one of those Irish names that has no equivalent in any other European language. Although I was astonished to learn some while ago that due to the popularity of the footballer Kevin Keegan, that for a year or two, Kevin was the most popular name given to boys in France. Metal Mike says, when communists took over Eastern European countries, they changed street and school names as a priority. Now it's happening in Canada. Chokerkin 666 says, women once denigrated me because I said St. Bridget was the patron saint of Ireland. She insisted it was only St. Patrick, an academic. Roulette Cracked said Yo Joe had a lemonade stand selling for 10 cents back in 56. A man said, how'd you like to make $10? His mom said, it's okay to do it, honey, but changing for him would be against our values. Okay. Euro Ministerium says, thoughts on BC Social Democrats' legacy. British Columbia NDP party was one of the last in the world, really, that was openly socialist. I mean, let's nationalize things. Let's nationalize everything we can. In fact, although I should admit that it was W.A.C. Bennett's social credit government that nationalized BC Electric in 1961 and turned it into BC Hydro. Most of the time, I could never understand what Elton was singing about, says Glib Medley. Well, you're not alone there. Yeah, the Social Credit Party of British Columbia, which ran the province for 20 years, and then again for a number of years under W.A.C. Bennett's son, Bill Bennett, had nothing to do with social credit ideology. It had proved popular in Alberta, and after Bible Bill Aberhart's attempt to create a new currency was struck down by the Supreme Court, Alberta's Social Credit Party gave up on social credit ideology, and it became sort of a standard center-right party. David Wright says Harry Shearer has some great semi-obscure impressions. Yeah, no, Harry Shearer is great. Harry Shearer is great. Bill Hader also has some really great semi-obscure impersonations. Euroministerium says Canada needs a new party to destroy the others. Conservatives are just liberals, liberals are just communists, and NDP are closer to Greens while maintaining commie policies. Our country is a joke. Half Galician mentions, Kevin Michael Godley of 10cc. Yes, I mentioned this on Monday. That is actually his name. David Rice says, I think Kevin moisturizes. No. Chokokin666 says Jay Dyer does a great Donald Pleasance impression. That's impressive. Metal Mike says 950 handpicked frontline healthcare workers got to attend Game 7 to watch the Leafs fail, much like our healthcare system. Yes, I thought that was quite appropriate. David Wright says Robert Klein's dad could never believe that Lorne Greene was Jewish. I don't know, perhaps that's because he was Canadian as well. He started off with the CBC. He was a newscaster, and he was known as the voice of doom. Lorne Greene also had a top 10 hit on the pop charts in the 1960s, a spoken word piece called Ringo, but a man with a gun. So let's talk about American oligarchy, because America is very much becoming an oligarchy. Here's a story from Carly Stern from the Daily Mail. Kamala Harris's stepdaughter, Ella Emhoff, models in first Vogue shoot celebrating the return of the mullet, which she calls ugly chic, just weeks after graduating from fashion school. Ella says that the mullet has been deemed unattractive and kind of odd, and she's really drawn to that almost ugly chic look. Yes, very appropriate in her case. The more you have this style, the more you want to push the limits of how mullety you can get. The 22-year-old became a style star during the 2021 inauguration and signed with IMG Models weeks later. I believe that that little black girl poet who wrote and delivered a terrible speech at Biden's inauguration has been signed by IMG Models as well. Ella Emhoff has since later run the walk the runway for Proenza Schuler and covered Dust magazine. Last month, she graduated from the New School's Parsons School of Design in New York City. Her stepmother, Kamala Harris, her father, Doug Emhoff, and her mother, Kirsten Emhoff, were all there to celebrate. Let's see. Ella Emhoff is a, let's say at best you could call her a plain woman. She is not model worthy. There's a style of fashion which attempts to make grown women look like little girls. It's rather disquieting or creepy, one might say. She looks like that she has come out of a trying to remember the name of this artist. Hang on, I'll just he's a cult artist, and he draws these disquieting pictures about young women. And Ella Emhoff reminds me of this artist. You could say that she rather resembles an Edward Gorey illustration, except again, Mark Ryden, that's the painter that I was thinking of. Emhoff resembles an Edward Gorey illustration, but again, she is not an attractive woman in any sense, but now she's going to be a top model. And why would that be? Because her stepmother, or Mamala, as we've been, it's insisted that we call her, her stepmother is Kamala Harris. No, America has not become a hereditary oligarchy. Why would you ask? And I was talking about the panopticon yesterday, and one of the reasons we have it is to fight crime. Well, of course, if the authorities are not interested in punishing lawbreakers, it doesn't matter if we have a video of everybody doing everything. This is from Sean Cohen at the Daily Mail. Homeless man, 48, who sucker punched an Asian woman, has been arrested 41 times since 1989 for armed robbery, assault, and drugs, as Manhattan DA recommends a year in jail for his crimes. Well, I can tell you right off the top that the only reason why Manhattan's DA is recommending 364 days imprisonment is because it was an Asian woman who was attacked. If it were someone other than an Asian woman, again, this person would not end up spending any time in prison at all. The homeless man has been arrested, yes, 41 times. At his arraignment Wednesday, prosecutors highlighted Wright's most recent arrests and recommending high bail to keep him behind bars. There's a picture of Alexander Wright here, and he is a black man, but of course, it's the fault of white supremacy or the model minority myth. I can't keep up. But yes, it's nothing to do with long-standing black resentment of Asians in America. Let's look at this fellow's rap sheet. Going back to 1989, robbery in the third degree, robbery in the first degree, menacing, robbery in the second degree, petty larceny, grand larceny, intent fraud, assault 2, serious injury, narcotics, drugs in selling, criminal trespass, drugs with intent to sell, criminal trespass, aggravated harassment, assault on a police officer with a deadly weapon, criminal possession of marijuana, drug paraphernalia, marijuana, lewdness, menacing in the second degree, 2 more of public lewdness, criminal possession of a controlled substance, that's from 4 years ago, assault 2, serious injury, menacing in the second degree with a weapon, aggregated harassment, communicating a threat, violent behavior, petite larceny, unlawful possession of marijuana, reckless endangerment, intent fraud, injured victim, 65 or older, assault with intent causes physical injury, 2 in 2020, criminal mischief, assault with intent to cause physical injury, assault 2, serious injury, twice in 2021, hate crime, assault 3, cause injury, and the latest one, assault with intent causes physical injury. And yet this person keeps being let out of prison because I suppose he is somehow a victim of the system. And, oh yes, I was talking about the Conservative Party of Canada yesterday, whose leader, Erin O'Toole, is committed as all get out to celebrating the accomplishments of alphabet people, be they male, female, or non-binary. Yes, he actually used that term. And, well, what to do about this for people on the right? Well, I suggested yesterday that people simply stop supporting the Conservative Party in any way. I was reminded with an email from a fellow called Mark Hecht that there is another alternative. He wrote me, this should not be considered a political endorsement. I don't make political endorsements on this show. He wrote me, as the author of the Vancouver Sun's op-ed, Can Ethnic Diversity and Social Trust Coexist, from September 2019, I appreciate the counterattack you mustered on Twitter against the woke mob that attacked me when my piece went into the Vancouver Sun and was subsequently extracted from the Sun. This is just to let you know that I'm now the official candidate for the People's Party of Canada in the next election. The riding is just up the road from you, Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. And so you can find him at the web at markhecht, HECHT.ca. The People's Party of Canada is led by Maxime Bernier, who was formerly a Quebec MP and cabinet minister, and lost a, shall we say, rigged leadership election to Andrew Scheer a few years ago. Bernier was far ahead, like 28,000 to 20,000 votes on the first ballot, and there was only one ballot, despite what the Canadian media might have you believe, but it was preferential voting. So it ended up being people's 13th or whatever choice that led to Andrew Scheer narrowly defeating Maxime Bernier. He quit the party and started his own one. It is the only party in Canada which has taken a strong stand against the sanitary dictatorship, against lockdowns. And previously, Bernier had become largely an unperson in Canada for his criticism of multiculturalism. So that is an alternative for Canadians. Now, oh yes. Let's talk about Suppressio Veri, which is the suppression of information which should be released. This is from Yahoo News. Psaki, that would be Jen, not Jennifer Psaki, lauds Fauci after release of emails from early days of the pandemic. During the White House briefing on Thursday, Press Secretary Psaki praised Dr. Fauci's role in the country's response to the coronavirus pandemic after his emails from January to June 2020 were released this week as the result of FOIA requests by news organizations. From the transcript, thank you, Jen. I know that you don't really want to litigate what happened when Biden was in the Oval Office and when those emails, that's a setup, she laughs. Fair enough. But has anyone from your team briefed the president on what was in those Fauci emails? Psaki said, I'm not aware of him being briefed on the publicly reported emails because they're not important. And given that there were some of the things that Fauci said previously that contradicted what he said publicly, whether it was masks or whether or not someone who had the virus could have immunity, or, other questions as well. I mean, does he still have confidence in his NIH director? Does this change anything at all? Psaki responded, no. The president and the administration feel that Dr. Fauci has played an incredible role in getting the pandemic under control, being a voice to the public throughout the course of this pandemic. And again, I would reiterate, a lot of these emails are from 17 months ago or more, certainly predating this administration, but some time ago as we look to history. In other words, Fauci, to the extent that he did anything wrong, and we're not admitting that he did anything wrong, it's Donald Trump's fault. 17 months ago, and the science has advanced. I'm not really aware of the science that demonstrates the efficacy of masks, but never mind that. Yes, mistakes were made. We declared definitively that certain things were true or certain things were not true, and now we're taking the opposite position or hedging. But that doesn't mean we were wrong to make these definitive statements back then. Because remember, we're dealing with experts here. We're dealing with bureaucrats, health bureaucrats, who, as we know, are the bestest people in the whole wide world. From Harriet Alexander and Chris Eberhardt of the Daily Mail, Donald Trump's former White House chief of staff has urged Congress to hold another hearing with Dr. Fauci to question him on what he knew about suggestions that COVID-19 could have escaped from a laboratory. Mark Meadows, Wednesday night, told Sean Hannity that the release of 3,000 of Fauci's emails earlier in the day made another hearing essential. Fauci has appeared before Congress several times to discuss the origins of the pandemic. He has confirmed that the U.S. did provide $600,000 over 5 years to the Wuhan laboratory to fund their research into coronaviruses transmitted from animals to humans. He also told Congress that even though the grant stipulated that no research be done into gain of function, making viruses more lethal or transmissible, he had no way of guaranteeing that the money was not used for the controversial science. Then don't give them the money, Dr. Fauci. On Wednesday, his emails obtained by BuzzFeed News via FOIA request showed that Fauci was warned that the coronavirus was possibly engineered in a lab before the pandemic started. Fauci seemed to be taking it seriously behind closed doors while downplaying the lab leak idea in public. Meadows said part of the troubling thing that we're seeing with these emails that are coming out is not only do they seem to correspond with what President Trump said and what Secretary Pompeo said in terms of the origins of the virus, but it indicates that Dr. Fauci had knowledge or at least a suspicion of things not happening in an evolutionary manner very early on. And he didn't share that with the task force. That's very troubling and something that we do need to get to the bottom of. Oh, yes. I got up this morning. I looked at Drudge. Well, what stories is Drudge going to have on the Fauci emails? Zero. Not a one. We're seeing pretty much the same thing that we saw with the Hunter Biden laptop and the explosive story, which was from the New York Post, and the explosive interview, which was on Fox News. Not a story. Not a story. There's nothing here. Wow. How about a deadly disease coming from some weirdo Bond villain laboratory in China, and chief spokesman for COVID prevention in the United States saying one thing in private and another thing in public, leading to a year and counting of lockdowns. No story there. We know what a story is. Let's have more about Pride Month. You can never get too many stories about that. This is from Zero Hedge. And of course, Zero Hedge was banned from social media because some months ago, Zero Hedge suggested what everyone is talking about now and what Dr. Fauci has pretty much confirmed. Fox News' Tucker Carlson ripped the utter fraudulence of Tony Fauci Wednesday night after BuzzFeed and the Washington Post obtained thousands of pages of emails through a FOIA request, revealing that the nation's top virologist was telling the public one thing while furiously working on damage control and narrative shaping as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded. According to Carlson, Americans assumed that, quote, the man in charge of protecting the U.S. from COVID must be rational and impressive. We also assumed he must be honest, but we were wrong. It soon became clear that Tony Fauci was just another sleazy federal bureaucrat, deeply political and often dishonest. More shocking than that, we learned that Fauci himself was implicated in the very pandemic he'd been charged with fighting. Fauci supported the grotesque and dangerous experiments that appeared to have made COVID possible, unquote. According to Tucker Carlson, Fauci's emails collectively show that, quote, from the beginning, Tony Fauci was worried that the public might conclude that COVID had originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Why would he be concerned that Americans would conclude that? Possibly because Tony Fauci knew that he had funded gain-of-function experiments at that very same laboratory. The emails prove that Fauci lied about this under oath, said Tucker, who highlighted an email from scientist Christian Anderson to Fauci, saying that he and his fellow scientists felt the virus looked potentially engineered and that members of his team all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Yes, Tucker Carlson. I watched this segment. I don't watch Fox News. I don't like to get my news from television because because it takes an awful lot of time and you don't get much news that way. But I watched a show, and he mentioned, interestingly, that one of the redactions in this email, the specific reason for the redaction, was that it could interfere in a criminal investigation, which suggests, Carlson noted, that Fauci himself is under criminal investigation. Tucker showed a clip of Fauci denying that Dr. Ralph Baric, a US-based virologist who collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology under Dr. Shi Zhengli, the bat lady. In retrospect, Carlson said about this clip, him denying that Baric had conducted gain-of-function research. This was under oath. It looks a lot like perjury. Yes. Carlson then mentioned Zero Hedge after UK virologist Jeremy Farrar passed along an article in which he suggested COVID-19 was man-made. Quote, "We now know that's a more plausible explanation than the one we believed at first and were told by the media, which is that corona came from a pangolin. And yet for the crime of saying that out loud, a more plausible explanation, Zero Hedge was banned from social media platforms. Until recently, you were not allowed to suggest that COVID might be man-made. Why couldn't you suggest that? The fact checkers wouldn't allow it." Why wouldn't they? Because Tony Fauci assured the tech monopolies that the coronavirus could not have been man-made. And so the tech monopolies shut down the topic, unquote. Is Tony Fauci going to survive this? Well, if the regime media has anything to say about it, or the Biden administration has anything to say about it, yes. Yes, he will. Donald Trump jumped into the fray, proving that he has been vindicated by this, and demanding that China pay a bounty or punishment or fine of $10 trillion for the damage that COVID-19 has caused. Now, Christopher Bedford writes in The Federalist how the media's COVID lies weaken America. What happens when the next big disease rolls around? And what if it's one that's actually as deadly as people thought COVID might be? Who can people trust? It was darkly funny at first how neither corporate media nor their Democrat friends could agree with a single thing President Donald Trump said, no matter how plausible or even obvious it was. He realized this and used it to great effect. When Trump said America needed to be great, corporate media said it had never been great. The New York Times even launched a massive project to prove this, although they later had to retract the opening thesis of the project that the colonists rebelled to preserve slavery. Their friends gave them a Pulitzer anyway. When Trump insulted the vicious and evil MS-13 gang of rapists and child murderers, calling them animals, corporate media defended MS-13. Attacking evil international gangs this way is extremely racist, they said. Bigotry. Emmy Award-winning journal Jamil Smith intoned in Rolling Stone. It requires that the enemy to be made out than less than human, and Trump has long made use of blurry lines to criminalize entire groups of people. When Trump said our European allies needed to contribute to their own defense and pay their bills, corporate media said that they didn't and that this was unfair. The president is threatening global security by asking Europe to be secure, they insisted. NATO will collapse if it's paid for, they warned. In the eyes of our reporting class, every single thing President Trump said or did had to be wrong. It started out entertaining and predictable, could also be troubling, depressing, and enraging. As when reporters played blind to murderous race riots, claiming that they were entirely peaceful, or when they refused to admit that the border is a human smuggling and human victimizing operation entirely run by foreign criminal cartels. That kind of reporting hurts people badly and does no service to the causes these reporters hope to champion. But when COVID-19 came to our shores, their obsession with taking the opposite side of President Trump became very dangerous to our entire country and is the final crack in their long fracturing and now collapsed role as a check on good governance. Oh, come on, that goes too far. When the media demands to know what flavor of ice cream Joe Biden is eating, they're shining light on secrets that must be revealed. I mean, wouldn't you say? The people have a right to know. What flavor of ice cream the president is eating? This is from Tristan Justice at the Federalist. A treasure trove of emails from the NIAID director, Dr. Fauci's, were made public this week, and that this email dump illustrates a dismissive physician who rose to fame to cover his own scandal. Again, I've talked about Fauci's role, not inconsiderable, in the AIDS disaster, and he somehow managed to survive this. Golly, how? How did he manage to survive that? People died. Thousands of people died horribly because they were prescribed a drug that was known to kill every single person who took it. Okay. And Fauci, he's not dead yet. He's got people like Morning Joe and Nicole Wallace to fight for him. This is from Christopher Eberhardt and Emily Crane of the Daily Mail. Fauci defends China and says it's far-fetched to think that they deliberately engineer something to kill themselves, as he doubles down on animal origins of COVID and dismisses out of context smoking gun emails. Fauci made his comments in an interview with News Nation Now anchor Leland Vittert on the Donlin Report. But even he admitted that he can't guarantee everything that is going on in the Wuhan lab. Fauci said Trump supporters resent him because they don't understand science. Yeah, okay. See, we mustn't be too mean to China. Okay. I'm reminded that according to no less than Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s, that he was speaking to Mao Zedong about the prospect of a nuclear war between the communist countries and NATO. And Mao did not seem to be terribly put out by this. When Khrushchev suggested that it was likely that somewhere along the order of 250 million Chinese would be killed in a nuclear exchange, Mao responded that there would still be 500 million left. That gives me a little bit of insight into their thinking. No, we mustn't drive the Chinese underground, says Fauci, says the man who provided money for ghastly experiments that took place in a lab which the United States government's diplomats had determined, 3 years ago, was not fit for purpose. Because what's the worst thing that could happen? Wendell Husbo writes in Breitbart, Dr. Fauci has not answered the following questions amid his released emails and role in funding coronavirus research abroad. How is gain of function defined? That's number one. Number two, if nearly $600,000 was not spent on gain of function, on what exactly was the money spent? 3, why does Fauci write in an email, urgent, we must discuss this gain of function research, while denying funding gain of function research? 4, why did Fauci not know if the NIH, if he directed the NIH to fund coronavirus research abroad? 5, why did Fauci sign off on funding research in a communist Chinese lab, knowing their truthfulness is dubious? 6, does Fauci excuse himself from a conflict of interest, advocating for funding a lab that presumably leaked a highly contagious virus? And 7, why did Fauci recommend canceling religious services March 5th, 2020, but approved campaign rallies and cruise ships for the healthy 4 days later? I saw a video of Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, on ET Canada, Entertainment Tonight, where he's talking about getting the jab. It is no exaggeration to say he is giggling like a schoolgirl discussing this almost mystical experience. And the interviewer, a woman, asks him, "Did you cry?" And Trudeau is a bit nonplussed by this. And I guess he was wondering how far he could go. He said, "Well, I cry at movies, but I didn't cry, when I got the jab." Later, Trudeau went on to say that Canadians should bully those people who have not got the jab. Oh, the curmudgeons and such like. He noted, as if this were surprising, that the very people who are hesitant about getting the jab are the same people who are the most upset with lockdowns. Golly, I wonder how that happens. No, you see, according to Trudeau, you may not like the jab, but it's better than getting COVID, isn't it? Well, no, Chris, he's not going to talk about relative risk because none of the politicians or bureaucrats are talking about relative risk because, no, risk assessment, that's not our business. And, okay. So, when Black people attack Asians in the United States, somehow this is the fault of white supremacists. And when people point fingers at China over COVID and for other reasons, this is the fault of the model minority myth. I am not making this up. Christopher Reynolds, Canadian Press today. Liberals, Tories clash over criticism of Chinese government and accusations of racism. Liberals and conservatives have stumbled into a thorny debate over fears that criticism of China can bleed into bigotry, as wariness of the global superpower rises alongside incidents of anti-Asian racism in Canada. Communist China cannot be trusted, Conservative Deputy Leader Candice Bergen said during question period in the House, May 26th. Will the Prime Minister commit to ending this research and this cooperation with the regime that actually wants to hurt Canada? Trudeau replied by warning Conservative lawmakers against wading into intolerance. The rise in anti-Asian racism we have been seeing over the past number of months should be of concern to everyone, he said. And so this is a typical Canadian Press story where let's corral a bunch of experts. So you're just going to get one side of it. They could have found, the reporter could have found other experts talking about China, but no. Sherry Wong, Executive Director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong, has experienced hateful harassment firsthand. There would be people spitting at me to say dirty racial slur at me. And this has happened to my family and friends as well. People became emboldened during this pandemic to even further this hatred and this xenophobia against Asian Canadians. Oh, she was spat upon, was she? Forgive me if I'm a little dubious about this. But apparently, communism is kind of a joke to the Canadian press. Some expert, Lynette Ong, associate professor in political science and China specialist at the University of Toronto, cautioned against exaggerated tales of shadowy operators. There's nothing illegal about trying to exert influence per se, even though because it's a communist country, and communist is actually put in scare quotes. People tend to look at influence from China with skeptical eyes. I wonder why that would be. Yes, there is much more. Okay, so according to Ong, we just got to cut this out, okay? Because this is a much more interdependent world, and we cannot easily draw a line in the sand dividing the world into two halves, calling outside stress on Chinese communism alarmist. Oh, and here we go. According to Weigo Zhang, associate professor of sociology at the University of Toronto's Mississauga campus, politicians have not focused on anti-Asian racism for years. They believe that anti-Asian racism is not a problem. Some non-racialized Canadians, and who racialized them, by the way, view of Chinese Canadians as a model minority translates in their eyes into a lack of prejudice, an attitude that it can infiltrate new Canadians' mindset as well. Yeah, it's related to a model minority myth. By behaving well, you will not be discriminated against, but you know that a model minority myth is a kind of discrimination in itself. Yes, we like you better than other minorities. Oh my God, the bigotry. The bigotry. These people will never be happy. So my old friend Jason Kenney is in hot water again. Kenney insists no rules were broken during Sky Palace patio dinner that defied COVID-19 restrictions. This is Lisa Johnson at the Edmonton Journal. Premier Kenney is doubling down on the claim that he and three of his cabinet ministers did not violate public health orders with a Tuesday night patio dinner at the federal building. Photos obtained by Postmedia show Kenney, Health Minister Tyler Shandro, Environment and Parks Minister Jason Nixon, Finance Minister Travis Toews, and at least two others eating on the patio of the offices commonly known as the Sky Palace. The rules, which took effect Tuesday, require physical distancing among members of different households in outdoor gatherings of up to 10 people. In the pictures, some of the group are seated closer than the required 2 meters apart, and none are wearing masks. Much was made that there was, alongside 1, 2, 3 bottles of San Pellegrino mineral water. We've got 2 bottles of wine and a bottle of Jameson's. And I'm going to have to play the well actually card here because this is being routinely referred to as Scotch whiskey. It is not Scotch whiskey. It is Irish whiskey. I'm tempted just to say who cares about this, but keep in mind that Jason Kenney is the same person who has had protesters arrested because they dared to go out in public to speak out against these insane lockdowns, and his government has seized church property and arrested pastors for holding religious services. So I hope that Jason Kenney gets nailed to the wall over this. And let's go to Lockdown Skeptics. All hail the Swiss doctor and his facts about COVID-19. On March 14, 2020, 3 days after the WHO declared a pandemic, note on COVID-19 appeared on the Swiss policy research site, which simply said, a Swiss doctor internist asked us to publish the following information on the current situation in order to enable our readers to make a realistic risk assessment. Yes, the site was early in raising flags on all these key aspects of the crisis, the evidence for a lab origin, the problems with PCR testing, false positives, and distinguishing deaths with and from COVID, infections declining before lockdown and being unaffected by restrictions, the dangers of ventilators, the lack of evidence for surface transmission, the ineffectiveness of masks, the problem of deaths caused by lockdown and panic, especially in care homes, the importance of early treatment, with the site using its medical expertise to introduce its own protocol in July 2020, issues around vaccine safety and efficacy, and the post-vaccine infection spike. The site has been especially useful for hearing from some of Europe's skeptics who can otherwise get missed in the Anglophone world. Wales takes super cautious approach to easing lockdown restrictions. 50% of UK adults fully vaccinated against COVID. Yes, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is demanding that all children, be vaccinated. Michael Gove hits at extension of furlough scheme. Portugal axed from the green list. Those are the list of safe countries. Sweden's mortality rate last year was lower than in 2015. End the mask mandates now. Launch of the Smile Free campaign. The virus looks engineered, Dr. Fauci was told by a leading scientist before both of them actively suppressed the lab leak story. And to finish up our coverage of this, we will go, as always, to Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. And Berenson was on Tucker Carlson's show last night, gave a good account of himself. His pinned tweet, I know a number of COVID books have already come out, but this is why I'm glad pandemia is not done yet, whether about Fauci, vaccines, or the media collusion with big tech. The story isn't close to over. Yes, his book, Berenson's upcoming book, Pandemia, How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights, and Lives is going to be published in the next few months by Regnery, I believe. And of course, we learned yesterday that Dr. Fauci's book, his Victory Lap, that it has been, orders for it have been canceled by Amazon and all other such book services. Ho, 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 ho. Berenson writes, attention citizens, your Department of Pandemia knows some of you are wondering what we knew and when we knew it. So are we. Our memory isn't what it used to be, and we accidentally drove over our laptop 10 times. But trust us, we'll do right by you, like always. Attention citizens. Meanwhile, the New York Times has a huge story looking hard at the emails and the evidence Fauci feared a lab leak. Ha! That was funny. JK, like my daughter said. Still nothing from the newspaper of record, except when the record conflicts with its ideology. Imagine that. No, we're not going to cover this story once again because we have a list of about 30 pride-related stories that we're going to have to get to before we consider covering the Fauci emails story. According to Berenson, a new low from USA Today, not a word about the substance of the Fauci mails. Instead, they fact-check their description as leaked rather than FOIA'd. You can bet if they actually were leaked, USA Today would be talking about Russian hackers. Don't know if it's just fallout from Tucker Carlson last night or if Twitter has suddenly taken its digital foot off my neck. But after months of slow growth, I have gained 15,000 followers in the last 24 hours. And yes, this matters. The bigger the audience, the harder I am for Twitter to muzzle, although no one is safe, as Donald Trump found out. Let's go back to the chat. Doggy biscuits for compliance, says a roulette cracked. Okay. Yes, I'd mentioned that about what Biden had said about the pointing out the role of the Jews in all pause-related things. Okay, what else do we have here? Oscar Toe says, don't worry, guys, Trump is coming back in August. Yes, I have seen the stories. I don't know how this possibly is going to work, but I stopped believing or even paying attention to any so-called plan some months ago. Mark Raymond writes, I learned to be anti-China, and anti-China is in quotation marks, while living in Taiwan. Maybe the liberal Canadian elite ought to spend a few years living on China's doorstep, and their naive pro-China illusions will melt away. Q copes are pathetic and counterproductive, says Camel69. Okay, Aslan says whining about meretricians and prostitutes is so damn boring. Ich habe genug. Chokin666 says a nation of John Browns, but stupider and with less integrity. Okay, so I have neglected my reading of Hilar Belloch's book on capitalism and property, Servile State, but I'm going to return to it, and I promise that I'm not going to neglect it in the future. So let's have an excerpt from this valuable book, first published in 1912. A perfect capitalist state cannot exist, though we have come nearer to it in modern England than other and more fortunate nations had thought possible. In the perfect capitalist state, there would be no food available for the non-owner, save when he was actually engaged in production. And that absurdity would, by quickly ending all human lives, save those of the owners, put a term to the arrangement. If you left men completely free under a capitalist system, there would be so heavy a mortality from starvation as would dry up the sources of labor in a very short time. This is a little off topic, but perhaps not. Grimes, who is the mother of Elon Musk's latest child, put out a TikTok video saying that my communist friends don't like AI But AI is great because it would bring about communism. You know, all the things that people love about communism. Oh, what might they be? You get all, no one would ever have to work if it were for AI. And of course, this woman has all these things written all over her face. She looks completely deranged and sounds completely deranged. But is this going to become a meme that communism, 3.0, is going to be enabled by artificial intelligence? Belloc continues, imagine the dispossessed to be ideally perfect cowards, the possessors to consider nothing whatsoever except the buying of their labor in the cheapest market, and the system would break down from the death of children and the out of works and of women. You would not have a state in more decline such as ours is. You would have a state manifestly and patently perishing. As a fact, of course, capitalism cannot proceed to its own logical extreme. So long as the political freedom of all citizens is granted, the freedom of the few possessors of land to grant or withhold it, of the many non-possessors to strike any bargain at all, lest they lack it, to exercise such freedom fully is to starve the very young, the old, the impotent, and the despairing to death. Capitalism must keep alive, by non-capitalist methods, great masses of the population who would otherwise starve to death, and that is what capitalism was careful to do to an increasing extent as it got a stronger and stronger grip upon the English people. Elizabeth's Poor Law at the beginning of the business, the Poor Law of 1834, coming at a moment when nearly half England had passed into the grip of capitalism, are original and primitive instances. There are today 100 others. Though this cause of insecurity, the fact that the possessors have no direct incentive to keep men alive, is logically the most obvious and always the most enduring under a capitalist system. There is another cause more poignant in its effect upon human life. That other cause is the competitive anarchy in production which restricted ownership coupled with freedom involves. Consider what is involved by the very process of production, where the implements in the soil are in the hands of a few whose motive for causing the proletariat to produce is not the use of the wealth created, but the enjoyment by those possessors of surplus value or profit. If full political freedom be allowed to any two such possessors of implements and stores, each will actively watch his market, attempt to undersell the other, tend to overproduce at the end of some season of extra demand for his article, thus glut the market only to suffer a period of depression afterwards, and so forth. Again, the capitalist, free individual director of production will miscalculate. Sometimes he will fail and his works will be shut down. Again, a mass of isolated, imperfectly instructed competing units cannot but direct their clashing efforts at an enormous waste, and that waste will fluctuate. Most commissions, most advertisements, most parades are examples of this waste. If this waste of effort could be made a constant, the parasitical employment it afforded would be a constant too. But of its nature, it is a most inconstant thing, and the employment it affords is therefore necessarily precarious. The concrete translation of this is the insecurity of the commercial traveler, the advertising agent, the insurance agent, and every form of touting and cozening which competitive capitalism carries with it. Now, here again, as in the case of the insecurity produced by age and sickness, capitalism cannot be pursued to its logical conclusion, and it is the element of freedom which suffers. Competition is, as a fact, restricted to an increasing extent by an understanding between the competitors, accompanied, especially in this country, by the ruin of the smaller competitor through secret conspiracies entered into by the larger men and supported by the secret political forces of the state. In a word, capitalism, proving almost as unstable to the owners as to the non-owners, is tending towards stability by losing its essential character of political freedom. No better proof of the instability of capitalism as a system could be desired. Take any one of the numerous trusts which now control English industry and have made of modern England the type, quoted throughout the continent, of artificial monopolies. If the full formula of capitalism were accepted by our courts and our executive statesmen, anyone could start a rival business, undersell those trusts, and shatter the comparative security they afford to industry within their field. The reason that no one does this is that political freedom is not, as a fact, protected here by the courts in commercial affairs. A man attempting to compete with one of our great English trusts would find himself at once undersold. He might, by all the spirit of European law for centuries, indict those who would ruin him, citing them for a conspiracy in restraint of trade. Of this conspiracy, he would find the judge and the politicians most heartily in support. But it must always be remembered that these conspiracies in restraint of trade, which are the mark of modern England, are in themselves a mark of the transition from the true capitalist phase to another. Under the essential conditions of capitalism, under a perfect political freedom, such conspiracies would be punished by the courts for what they are, to wit, a contravention of the fundamental doctrine of political liberty. For this doctrine, while it gives any man the right to make any contract he chooses with any laborer and offer the produce at such prices as he sees fit, also involves the protection of that liberty. It involves the protection of that liberty by the punishment of any conspiracy that may have monopoly for its object. If such perfect freedom is no longer attempted, if monopolies are permitted and fostered, it is because the unnatural strain to which freedom, coupled with restricted ownership, gives rise, the insecurity of its mere competition, the anarchy of its productive methods, have at last proved intolerable. I have already delayed more than was necessary in this section upon the causes which render a capitalist state essentially unstable. I might have treated the matter empirically, taking for granted the observation which all my readers must have made, that capitalism is as a fact doomed and that the capitalist state had already passed into the first phase of transition. We are clearly no longer possessed of that absolutely political freedom which true capitalism essentially demands. The insecurity involved, coupled with the divorce between our traditional morals and the facts of society, have already introduced such novel features as the permission of conspiracy among both possessors and non-possessors, the compulsory provision of security through state action, and all these reforms, implicit or explicit, the tendency of which I'm about to examine, and we will begin tomorrow with the stable solutions of this instability. I'll just mention that since Belloc wrote this book in 1912, so much of what he predicted has come to pass. Capitalism, as it was traditionally understood, and you see explicated in all the textbook, was essentially abolished by Alan Greenspan circa 2000. No, the business cycle no longer exists. We don't need any of this up and down anymore. We can use interest rates and the creation of money to control this. Meanwhile, as Adam Smith pointed out, all businessmen seek a monopoly. There were restrictions on monopolistic behavior in the past, but they have pretty much all been swept away. And we're very close to the situation of, everything except shoes. We'll have one company that sells everything and is responsible for all media. This is the direction in which we're going. Of course, the same people, the same so-called conservatives who have not noticed that capitalism has been abolished, not just in the end of recession, in the end of the business cycle, but in the matter of, financiers who make bad bets will have to suffer the consequences. No, they no longer have to suffer the consequences because it's unthinkable. We can't have billionaires losing money because that would impair confidence in the system and would have disastrous consequences. And, yes, let's talk about culture. In about 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about one of the greatest movies ever made, The Fallen Idol. But there was a opinion piece in the Washington Post that got a lot of attention, and I want to talk about it. The opinion piece is written by someone called Charlie Jane Anders. And I thought, that's a rum name. So I went to Wikipedia, and I was immediately drawn to the portrait of Charlie Jane. Like this, is it? According to Wiki, Charlie Jane Anders is an American writer and commentator. She has written several novels, published magazines and websites, and hosted podcasts. In 2005, she received the Lambda Literary Award in the transgender category, and in 2009, the Emperor Norton Award. Her 2011 novelette, 6 Months, 3 Days, won the 2012 Hugo and was a finalist for the Nebula and Theodore Sturgeon Awards. Her 2016 novel, All the Birds in the Sky, was listed number 5 on Time Magazine's top 10 novels of 2016, won the 2017 Nebula Award for Best Novel, the 2017 Crawford Award, and the 2017 Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel. It was also a finalist for the 2017 Hugo Award for Best Novel. I see I'm in Vox Day territory here because science fiction has been colonized by alphabet people. Anders says sensory integration disorder. I don't know what that means, and I don't really want to know. Is it some form of neurodivergence? But in any event, here's the piece. Grown-ups, it's okay to love pop culture for kids. Stop being embarrassed about it. Yeah, thank you for that. Just the headline alone, and of course I will remind you, as I'm sure you know already, that the authors of pieces typically do not write the headlines. And it's a common complaint of journalists and other writers that don't blame me for the headline, but in this case, the headline, I think, actually represents, truthfully, what is in the piece. Someone called Spiral Curse DeMarco responded, you'll have to forgive the profanity, this kind of shit drives me nuts. Almost every piece of dominant media is pop culture for kids. The whole world agrees with you. You won. It's over. Monoculture is a thing now. You don't also have to have a chip on your shoulder about it like anyone is telling you not to watch. Hey, pal, I'll like Cruella and Taylor Swift if I want to. I'll enjoy superhero movies and Pixar stuff as an adult because I want to. Cool. Go ahead. Who gives a shit? And Glenn Kenney, who's a book made man about Goodfellas, I praised on the book club a few weeks ago, commented, I mean, it's true that it's okay to love pop culture for kids. It's not criminal. You don't need to be embarrassed as such, but once you've made your choice, keep to your lane. Don't say a word to me about how you don't get Eric Romer. Have your wallow and let me be. Dan responded to Glenn Kenney, newsflash to the Underoos Brigade. You won your battle such as it is. No one is required to bow and scrape in your presence or to love your children's movies, just as we aren't forcing you to love Romer films or movies where nothing was shot before a green screen. Well, you can see, I see this really as part of the continuing backlash from what Martin Scorsese said. What was it, a year ago? That he said, for all their technical accomplishments, that Marvel movies were not cinema as he understood it, that they were more like amusement park rides. And the Underoos Brigade has been seething about this ever since. How dare he? Charlie Jane Anders is the author of the young adult novel Victory is Greater Than Death. And this person begins, it would be easy to assume that Cruella, a live-action origin story for the cartoon villainess of 101 Dalmatians fame, is the summer's first family movie. After all, it's inspired by a beloved cartoon. But Cruella is rated PG-13, and that's no accident, despite Disney's Kids of All Ages brand. As Cruella star Emma Stone told the New York Times, kids will find it interesting, perhaps, but it's more naturally designed for teenagers and older. I mean, we can all see what's going on with Cruella, right? They're turning the villainess into the heroine because Cruella is a strong woman. And she certainly, she looks strange. Some sort of goth punk rock warrior princess slay queen. Yes, we can all see what's happening here. The writer continues, Cruella is part of a larger trend, the repurposing of stories and worlds created for children and grittied up for adults. from the PG-13 films based on 1980s toys, such as Transformers and G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, to the rise of the Marvel superhero movies as a world-conquering phenomenon, to Joker, an R-rated film about a supervillain who used to be obsessed with making fish laugh, kids have conquered pop culture, only to find it's not for them anymore. Yeah, that's why they call it a monoculture. Yes, in the book, we learn about this, more about this in the book Boomers. It's all the same now. It's just all part of a stew. There's no high culture, middle culture, low culture, folk culture anymore. It's all the same. And in the world of the monoculture, DJ Kill All Beckies is just as important musically and culturally as Beethoven or Schubert or whoever you want to mention, who they're suspect, of course, because they're dead white males. While most generations eventually set aside childish things, something different happened with pop culture in the 1980s. The kids who loved it grew up and didn't want to stop. Yes, the boomers. Industries took note. Comic books started being sold in specialty stores aimed mostly at adult fans instead of on spinner racks at drugstores and convenience stores. Fan conventions went from niche affairs to huge extravaganzas featuring A-list stars. Home video allowed fans to rewatch their favorite media to the point of memorization, and the movie industry veered toward the four-quadrant blockbuster aimed at both older teens and adults. There was always something dark and gothic at the core of many children's stories, as anyone who's read the unalloyed Grimm brothers' tales and the earliest superhero comics will attest. You're seriously comparing the Grimm brothers to what, Superman of the 1940s? Well, I suppose you would, because it's all of a piece to you. But there was also a glorious silliness and sweetness to these stories that allowed us to skip over gaping holes in story logic. That's because they were written for children. They were written for children. But everything has to be for everybody now. Worst of all, according to Charlie Jane, the need to be taken seriously so as not to embarrass older fans meant that stories could no longer take such wild leaps into the improbable. To justify clinging to these stories as adults, grown-ups pushed aside the qualities that made us fall in love with them in the first place. It's true that the original spirit of these stories live on in animation. Batman and Star Wars have been revitalized by animated series that catered mostly to kids and originated such vibrant characters as Harley Quinn. Yeah, Slay Queen. But for pop culture to remain fresh and vital, we need new stories, characters, and settings to inspire new audiences. Not going to happen. The streaming wars may be our salvation. Services such as Netflix, Disney Plus, and HBO Max are investing heavily in new children's content. Yes, where 5-year-olds can learn about gender diversity. Get ready, kiddies. Well, of course, it's already happening. Because they've realized that no parent wants to explain to their kids why they can no longer watch their favorite cartoon. You know, their favorite cartoons still exist in physical form, parents. You can buy them for your kiddies if you like. Hurry, hurry while stocks last. This person concludes, the kids who grew up with a new golden age of children's programming will do the same thing we did, insist that their beloved stories grow up along with them. Golly, I hope not. That's okay as long as their children have new stories of their own to fall in love with. Well, this Charlie Jane person writes stories specifically for children or for teens, which is a genre which didn't exist until fairly recently. And instead of being about the wide world or the wild world and all of the strange things in it, things that you don't know, things that would be exciting, it's all about non-binary, non-white people with body image problems, because you wouldn't want to inspire children by writing to them about things of which they do not already know. It's just, the pain, the pain, the pain. Of course, people are wondering how long this can last, the MCU, DCU, because these models are predicated on packed theaters and of people going to see these films again and again and again in packed theaters. This needs to happen in order to justify the typically hundreds of millions of dollars, the cost of filming and the cost of marketing these films. So these films are made to make $1 billion or more. And if they don't make $1 billion, then they are perceived to have failed. Does COVID mean that this model is busted? Well, the jury is still out on that, but golly, I sure hope so. Let's look at the chat before we move into a theater Thursday. Palpicasso88 says, Dumbo was about a flying elephant. I didn't know Lena Dunham got a pilot's license. Yes, rim shot. Ronald P says, a young adult and alphabet people are big on book sites now, and new history books are propaganda. Palpicasso88 says, Network should have won the Oscar for Best Picture instead of Rocky. Network, that movie came out in the 1970s, right? Just let me check here. Around 1976? 1976. Got it in one. You see this in this film. We have William Holden, and he's a married man, and he starts an affair with Faye Dunaway. They're just, you see how art reflects life. There's just innumerable films that came out in the 1970s. Well, I guess this trend started around 1969, of middle-aged men, married or not married, having it off with sexy, much younger women, and suffering a moral crisis because of it. Too funny. Too funny. There is a movie that came out in this genre called Save the Tiger. Stars Jack Lemmon. It came out in 1973, and Lemmon, who this is perhaps the worst performance of his career, and of course he won the Academy Award for Best Actor, and there is just an excruciating scene where he smokes dope for the first time and then starts raving about Auschwitz. It has to be seen to be believed. It's truly, truly, truly ghastly. Jack Lemmon, of course, did some fine work, but he was always tempted to go too far. And I suppose that in his later career, only James Foley managed to restrain him in Glengarry Glen Ross. Excellent movie, by the way. Joe is a trip, says Glib Medley. True Greenberg says, when Dunaway's character says she has daddy issues, it's a bit much. Still hot, though. Palpicasso88 says, I caught Save the Tiger on TCM a while ago. Horrible. Peter Boyle, I can't get the visual out of my head, says Don Willis. I always liked Lemmon better in comic roles, says Am Run. Let's see. Bellick. Bellick definitely had a British Catholic critique. He was very much influenced by Cardinal Manning and his social theory that finding a middle position between capitalism and socialism. I mean, if you look at people like Herbert Spencer, if you read him, and a lot of libertarians still idolize him. Andrew Carnegie idolized Herbert Spencer. When Belloc writes about, those who do not work will be condemned to starve, that's pretty much Spencer, straight up. Okay, let's get to it here. Theater Thursday. The Fallen Idol, directed by Carol Reed, and it is based on a short story by Graham Greene. And Graham Greene must be the most filmed author. After Stephen King? There are literally dozens of his short stories, novellas, and novels which have been filmed, some of them more than twice. Graham Greene was a film critic himself, and there's a amusing story about this, that he was working for a small magazine called Night and Day, a fairly new magazine. He was a film critic in the 1930s. And he did a review of the Shirley Temple film called Wee Willie Winkie. And he suggested that there was more than a touch of pedophilia to Shirley Temple and her act and how it was perceived by the audience. And this led to a libel suit, which led to the magazine being shut down, which led to Graham Greene fleeing to Mexico. Carol Reed, let's see. Has any director had a three-picture, 3-year run such as Carol Reed had? In 1947, he directed Odd Man Out. In 1948, he directed The Fallen Idol. And in 1949, he directed The Third Man. That is pretty impressive. If you look at some of his other films, Night Train to Munich is very exciting. Our Man in Havana, which he directed and produced, is based on a Graham Greene novel, and that has a great cast and is quite good. The Agony and the Ecstasy, 1965, as seen as Oscar bait and overblown. In 1968, he had an enormous hit with the musical version of Oliver Twist called Oliver, which made Lionel Bart a very rich man. Hollywood is typically not kind to old men, and his last two films, 1970 called Flap, the less said about the better, and his final film, 1972, is called Follow Me, based on a Peter Schaefer play. Oliver Reed, Sir Carol Reed, much like Alfred Hitchcock, he cut his teeth on what were known as quota quickies. The British government was concerned that such was the power of Hollywood, that the British film industry would be strangled in its cradle. And so they created a mandatory British content rule for British cinemas. And by 1935, 20% of all films shown in British cinemas must be British made or Dominion, because Australia and Canada counted as well. And so you can imagine what happened. If they've got to show 20%, well, someone's got to make the films, and quantity rather than quality. These were films which were made quickly and cheaply. Often almost Roger Corman quickly. But, when you make a lot of films, you learn about making films. This is an opportunity that today's directors, or directors for the last few decades, have not had. I mean, the existence of B films was very good for the industry, and it was very good for motion pictures as an art form, because it was a kind of apprenticeship for filmmakers. And again, they don't get that anymore. The Fallen Idol, the title refers to the character played by Ralph Richardson, Baines, who works at an embassy in London. It is not specified which embassy this is, perhaps for fear of giving offense or legal action. Could be the French embassy, could be the Belgian embassy, could be the Luxembourg embassy. But then it's even cloudier than that, because the ambassador is played by a German actor, and the first secretary is played by a Czech actor who speaks with a very pronounced Middle European accent, but it's not really all that important. Richardson's character, Baines, who is kind of the head butler or major domo of the establishment, is the fallen idol. You know, this movie could have easily have been called Secrets and Lies, because that's what it is about. It's a rather unique film in that it is shot almost entirely from the point of view of an 8-year-old boy. And the 8-year-old boy, whose name is Philippe, although he calls himself Phil, he lives a very strange life. His parents, the ambassador and his wife, are rather distant. They don't seem to have much to do with him. And as the movie begins, we see that his father, the ambassador, is leaving in order to collect his wife, Phil's mother, who has been quite seriously ill and has been gone for months. The framing device of the film is that the ambassador and his wife leave, and at the end of the film, they come back. And while the cat's away, the mice will play. So, as I say, this is a film about being a child, and there aren't very many films made about being a child. There's certainly very few good ones, because the worldview of a child is very different from that of an adult. Children are ignorant. They are terribly ignorant. They don't know very much about the world and how it works, and what they do know is, or do what they think they know, is typically wrong. The film begins with a shot of Phil. He's at the top of a spiral staircase looking at all of the beaverish activity, you know, the preparations for the ambassador's departure. And we see him framed between the spokes of a balustrade, thus symbolizing the kind of prison that childhood is. Now, children are protected in many ways, but they are protected from the outside world. It is kind of a loving prison, you could say. Children want to burst out of this prison, and sometimes they do. Certainly Phil does in this film. One of the things that children are obsessed by is height, because they are small and adults are large. And we see in this film, I must say that the cinematography by Georges Perrenal is outstanding. Just this concentration on height, on this importance of different levels, observing things from different levels. Again, at the beginning of the film, Phil is observing all that's going on from a position of great height. So this, in effect, it kind of gives him a godlike view of the circumstances. Of course, he understands little of what's going on, but children want to be tall. All children want to be tall, and Phil has made himself tall. Phil has a surrogate father in Baines. And I think one of the reasons why the relationship is so close is because Baines is, in some ways, an overgrown child himself. All the frenzied activity at the first scene of the film, Baines stops and he looks up at Phil, hiding at the top of the staircase, and he gives him a big wink, as if to say, we all know this is all, we both know that this is nonsense. Baines has a wife, and she is played by Sonia Dresdel. This is a really impressive performance. It's a brave performance too, because this is one of the nastiest women that you will ever see in film. This is a woman who doesn't seem to have any redeeming qualities. Of course, you can see her as a exemplifying the wicked stepmother role. That Ralph Richardson is the surrogate father, and she is the evil stepmother. She seems to, her delight in pettiness, her delight in petty cruelty to her husband and to Phil, it seems to be what is keeping her alive. Now, when you look at this boy, when you look at Bobby Henri, who plays Phil, one would think that any parents would be delighted to have such a boy, such a beautiful, precocious boy as their child. But she clearly resents him. Why? We don't know. We can speculate. We don't know. The Baineses, they don't have children of their own. Whether this was by design or that one or the other was infertile, we don't know. But clearly, as the result of this infertility on their part, she displays this tremendous resentment towards this boy who he's not perfect. He is very much like a real boy. That is to say, he is alternately excited and bored by the world. Think back to when you were a child. Think back to when you heard, sorry, there's a lunatic shouting outside. Think back to when you were a child. Think back to when you were listening to adult conversations and how you would pick out a word or a phrase and think this was significant, but mostly you just found it terribly, terribly boring. And the habit of adults of seemingly having the same conversation over and over again, you think, why do they keep talking about this? I mean, and they always say the same things. Why don't they talk about something else? You also remember when you were a child, when you would be taken out by your parents. And if you were taken out by your parents to do something, Phil gets taken to the London Zoo, and this is a delightful outing for him. But parents will, take children out shopping, they're shopping, that sort of thing. And children like to make some fun of it, which is often disruptive, and they get told off, and it's just the most boring thing in the world. I remember as a boy, my mother would take me out, and she'd be buying clothing or something, and I wanted to lay down on the floor. I was so bored. Speaking of height, I'll tell you a story from my own childhood that I guess it would have been in 1963 at the old Capitol Theater, an old vaudeville palace in Vancouver on Granville Street, before it was turned into a dull set of multiplexes. These roadshow films, they called them. We were coming to the end of the roadshow era, but there were still a few years left. I believe it was called The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. And at intermission, we went to the lobby to buy snacks or some such. And I got separated from my parents. And I seemed to be imprisoned in a forest made up of giants. And I just felt absolute panic that I was going to be lost forever, because I could, dart in one direction or another direction, but there was no, guarantee that I was going to find my parents, because, again, I was surrounded by giants. So our hero, Phil, he has a garter snake, which is a secret, one of the many secrets in this film. And he keeps it out on the balcony. It has a hiding space. A brick has come loose, and he puts the snake there when it's not in his pocket or not in his hand to protect the snake from evil Mrs. Baines. Mrs. Baines has made it clear that no, she's not going to allow vermin in her house. Now, again, the The mindless pettiness of this is quite disturbing. Why would anyone be so upset by such a harmless little snake? And again, Mrs. Baines seems to resent the innocent joy that Phil takes in his snake. And she is very big on people not telling lies. Yeah. Well, everyone tells lies. People hardly go an hour without telling some sort of lie. I mean, that's one of the truths of human nature, as unfortunate as it may be. At one point, Phil says we've got to think of lies and tell them all the time, and then they won't find out the truth. Now, Baines is involved in a adulterous relationship, at least adultery in his heart, because who wouldn't want to get away from Mrs. Baines? And there is a secretary in the embassy who is played by a French actress called Michelle Morgan, who I mentioned yesterday is one of the most beautiful women that I've ever seen in my life. And there's a kind of imperiousness, a kind of unapproachable quality to her, which is intrinsic to beauty, which is not the same thing as attractiveness. Michelle Morgan didn't really have much of a career in Hollywood or in non-French films because the handling of her was botched. But to match the beauty of her form with the warmth and kindness of her character makes a very powerful effect. You know, Baines, he realizes that even though, you know, he's picked a wrong and that this was his responsibility. And as much as he wants his freedom, he feels guilty. He says, there are faults on both sides, Phil. We don't have any call to judge. Perhaps she was what she was because I am what I am. We ought to be very careful, Phil, because we make one another. And Phil says, I thought God made us. Baines says, trouble is, we take a hand in the game. Yes, indeed. You know, we are tempted when we see depictions of women like Mrs. Baines to think, you know, what a horrible, horrible woman she is. But we don't generally take much of a look at, well, how did she get this way? Because as a rule, people aren't born horrible. Mrs. Baines is a threat, a terrible threat to Phil throughout the entire movie. She becomes, actually, there seems to be some suggestion that she might go so far as to kill him because he stands in the way of something that she wants. Phil has been dragged into a secret. Baines says, there's lies, and Mrs. Baines says, what do you mean by that? And Baines says, some lies are just kindness, which is true. Baines has created a heroic persona in order to entertain Phil. He's a man of the world. He's traveled everywhere. He spent years in Africa, darkest Africa, where he killed a lion with a gun and fought off a native rebellion. Just one man, just he, with his pistol. I should warn listeners, if you are of a sensitive disposition and if you are going to be terribly offended by terms that were commonplace in the 1940s to describe Africans, then I suppose you shouldn't watch these films. Now, of course, you know, a more sophisticated or older boy than Phil would not have been so crushed when he found out that Baines had made up these stories, because the older you get, the less innocent you become. There's the script, which is attributed to Graham Greene. The dialogue is attributed to two others. There's a very good note, a very pleasing note that Baines eventually confesses to a police detective that despite all of his big talk, he has never left Britain. But then he adds, oh, yes, except once to Ostend. That is really good. That is really good writing. Ostend, well, that doesn't count. So lies, 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 lies. So we see Baines with his assignations with Julie, the secretary, and Julie has decided to return to France because she can't bear the heartache of being with Baines. She wants to be with Baines, and Baines wants to be with her. But Baines is married. She doesn't want to become one of those women who carries on sexually with a married man. And the situation appears to be hopeless. And as the film begins, we find out that Baines is desperately attempting to keep Julie from leaving. He says, as adulterers or would-be adulterers always do in films, and perhaps even in life, that he is going to have it out with his wife, that he is going to demand his freedom, get a divorce. Yes, if Baines were to get a divorce, if he were to divorce his wife, who is a senior housekeeper in the embassy, this would not be very good for his career, would it? I should mention some of the technical aspects of this film. The art direction is, well, golly, it is some of the most impressive that I've ever seen. When you look at the embassy from the inside, you marvel that was a set, because it has a vast foyer with a checkerboard pattern in marble tile, and of course suggesting a chess game, is suggesting Lewis Carroll, suggesting a labyrinth. Baines being an overgrown child, we see him and Julie actually playing hide and go seek with Phil, and Baines is certainly having the time of his life. But of course, in a way, this embassy is a kind of paradise for Phil, because of the vast spaces and all of the different rooms and all the exploring he can do. Plus, from the balcony, he has easy access to the stairs leading 4 or 5 stories down to the street, so he can explore London if he chooses to. Later, we see Baines and Julie being and Phil himself being like prey in this labyrinth. And of course, I should have mentioned right from the very beginning that the heavy symbolism of Phil's snake, the snake in the Garden of Eden, the snake who brought sin into the world, which obviously the Catholic Graham Greene would very much have appreciated. I should talk about Henri's acting, which is very impressive, but children cannot act. Acting requires self-consciousness, and an 8-year-old does not have self-consciousness. Self-consciousness arrives at the time of puberty. So we can credit Carol Reed for the success of Bobby Henri's role. Just as in The Shining, we can credit Leon Vitali with the success of Danny's performance, because, again, children can't act. So Baines enters into a pact with Phil, that Phil has, he's blundered into a tea shop where he sees Baines and Julie, who Baines calls his niece, and Phil is so ignorant of the ways of the world that he doesn't understand that there's clearly an affair, or would-be affair, going on here. He's just interested in getting tea, getting another cream bun, or whatever. So he's sworn to secrecy. But Mrs. Baines, who is a rather clever woman, quickly realizes that something is up, that her husband is up to something. What is it? And suddenly she becomes a very kind, a very phony kind to Phil, and promises a Meccano set if he keeps a secret from with her. So he's got two pacts going at the same time, and of course they both can't be kept up. There is also a strong theme of fear of heights, of falling, the fallen idol in this film. The balcony from the very beginning, and the outside staircase, the great length of the winding staircase. And of course, there is a part of the embassy which is not meant to be reached by foot, which Phil does with, fateful consequences afterwards. You all know about Chekhov's gun, and we see a gun near the beginning of the film, and that plays out. But we kind of get to, Chekhov's staircase in this film as well, which plays out more significantly than the gun does. So the police are called after a terrible thing happens, and Phil has decided, again, he didn't actually see what happened, but he believes that he has witnessed a murder. And he loves Baines so much that he determines that he is going to protect him from the police by lying, even though there was no need for him to lie. And you see, this goes back to the ignorance of youth. The children are very quick, exceedingly quick, to jump to conclusions based on insufficient evidence. I should mention the role of the police in this film, because, to anyone who's familiar with English policemen, recent English policemen, this would be kind of shocking. We get P.C. Plod, played by Torrin Thatcher, who's a face that you will see in many British films. All of the policemen are kindly. They are dressed in, the constables are dressed in their traditional bobby uniform. They are not wearing these hideous fluorescent yellow vests. They are not carrying, a dozen different pieces of kit, just the helmet and a baton. There's quite a magical scene when Phil escapes from the embassy because of the terrible thing that he believes that he has witnessed. And he just runs barefoot and in his pajamas through the soaking wet cobblestone streets until Torrin Thatcher, the PC, sees him and very kindly attempts to get him to the station, because the boy is frightened and cold and doesn't want to speak. He's been traumatized, as we all like to say. We see Bernard Lee, who of course had a major role in The Thin Man the next year as a police inspector. And we have a fine performance from the Irish actor Dennis O'Day as the chief inspector. The great Jack Hawkins appears as a detective. And there's a kind of a kindness, a gentleness, a decency to these coppers in this film, which is very reassuring. Now, I understand that people will say this is an idealized version of how police were. But knowing that in 2021, or certainly in 2020, poor little Phil would probably have been arrested by the police and thrown into a cell for breaking some sort of COVID regulation. The way that he is treated, again, it inspires great affection for the era. And there is a notable cameo by a woman called Dora Bryan, who plays, I suppose, what you would call, they used to call a drab, a prostitute, with her cheap, transparent, plastic mac over her lurid dress. I'd be interested to know whether this film had to have cuts made for the American market, because Rose, the prostitute, she cannot help speaking sexual innuendo. And there's also a rather amusing scene where when she finds out who Phil's father is, she says, "Oh, I know him," suggesting that Phil's father, the ambassador, is one of her clients. The movie, this is a movie of exceedingly great tension. There is a thrilling scene which revolves around a telegraph that Mrs. Baines had, just very deceptive, or fully deceptive telegraph that Mrs. Baines had sent, explaining that she would be away for the day, visiting a sick relative. Well, it was a ruse, and Phil has made the telegraph into a paper airplane, or dart, as they would say in England, and he throws it, and it lands into a bunch of flowers in the embassy, and it becomes important for Baines to get a hold of this dart, and we see the dart being thrown and flying and flying and flying and landing, and is anyone going to pick it up? Also, near the end of the film, the audience is practically screaming, to go to the top, go to the forbidden part of the embassy, because that's where the secret is revealed. This is, as I said, a beautiful and moving film, a very unusual film because of its honest depiction of childhood, and its very honest and non-sentimental depiction of the disappointments and the sins of adulthood. Unfortunately, it is not available on Blu-ray in the United States for some reason. You can watch it on Amazon Prime Video, or you can buy the British Film Institute restoration, which is produced in England by Studio Canal, which looks exceptional. This is a black and white movie of exquisite beauty, and the restoration is a very good deed indeed by British Film Institute. Of course, you will need a Regions-free player to play this Blu-ray, but you've heard me go on about that before, and I won't do it this time. Just to say that, to repeat, this is one of the finest films that I've ever seen, and I think that it's a film that any intelligent person would greatly appreciate. Okay, so let's take a final look at the chat. The footprint was moving away from the window, says unofficial KMG fan club. Anran says, I have the Criterion DVD. Again from Anran, best use of a paper airplane in a movie ever. Yeah, I guess second greatest would be the paper airplane in the Ramones Rock and Roll High School. Jules Roy says, if you have Roku, you can watch this film for free on the TV Time app. Thank you for that. He adds, Michelle Morgan had the most beautiful eyes. Anran says, I love the detail of Philippe apologizing to Mrs. Baines just as she gets rid of the snake. What's this? Also a special KMG reality tour where you stay in a motel and I shoot off guns and scream outside. Yes. Okay. Okay, let's see. Reed should get the credit. Guy Hamilton, the assistant director, who later worked on James Bond films, said Hervey couldn't act at all and had the attention span of a demented flea. I think some kids can act, though. Both children in The Others with Nicole Kidman acted really well. All other child actors suck, says Gamion. There's a temptation for child actors to, for children in general, The children are infuriating in this regard. They say a joke and it gets a laugh. And oftentimes it's just sort of a pity laugh. So they'll say a joke again, louder and harder, and then again and again and again. And there's a tendency amongst child actors, to be cute. We've got to be cute all the time because adults seem to love cuteness. Enron says, per IMDb, Bobby Henri went to Oxford, moved to the USA to be an accountant. As of 2001, was working as a hospital chaplain, yes, a deacon in Greenwich, Connecticut. Yes, a strange story. Enron says, I don't find Julie being in love with Baines fully believable. He is nice and kind, but still a middle-aged butler with average looks. Well, Ralph Richardson, I haven't talked about him. Richardson was one of the theater greats of the 20th century in England, but rather like Alec Guinness, he wasn't one for the big heroic roles. There was a really an otherworldly quality about Ralph Richardson, which is very well expressed in this film. And just as he captivated Phil, you can see how he could captivate even a woman as beautiful as Michelle Morgan. Evil seems too harsh to describe Mrs. Baines, says Enron. Would an evil woman really be so obviously concerned when it looked like Phil might fall off the ledge? Oh, I don't know. There's more than one reason why she might be concerned, because she's worried of being blamed for it. Oh, okay. So this is it for today. Let's talk about what is coming. McGregor put in a good performance, says Jules Roy. Let's talk about what's coming up culture-wise on my show. Another English movie next week. Of course, it was directed by an American, a refugee from Austria, Fred Zinnemann. It's from 1966. It won the Best Film Oscar the next year. It's called A Man for All Seasons, and it's about Sir Thomas More. In 2015, a documentary, in June 17th, a documentary from 2015 about an English filmmaker who went to America and his interrogation by a French filmmaker who stayed in France. It's called Hitchcock Truffaut, and it is sort of, how would you say? It's sort of a short and visual version of the famous book that Truffaut wrote about Hitchcock, where they go into Hitchcock's films nuts and bolts. On June the 24th, a film from Japan by Kenji Mizoguchi Ugetsu. And on July the 1st, which is Canada's generic national holiday day, I'm going to be talking about Billy Wilder's much reviled 1964 movie, Kiss Me Stupid. On the book club tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about a novel by an American actress, originally from Poland, Dagmara Dywinczyk. It's called The Lullaby of Polish Girls. On June the 11th, I'm going to be talking about Rush's American Pilgrim. On June the 18th, a dystopian novel by Stanley Bing called Immortal Life. On June the 25th, I reviewed a previous memoir by Peter Kemp, the soldier, and his follow-up to the one that I previously reviewed called No Colors or Crest. And on July the 2nd, which is my birthday, I'm going to be discussing A Short History of Canada by Desmond Morton. And on Music Monday, next Monday, June the 7th, I'm going to be discussing the utterly bizarre story of Bill Drummond, the KLF, and what happened to the £1 million. On June the 14th, I'm going to be talking about Bertrand Goldschmidt, rediscovered. On June the 21st, I'm going to be talking about the rather strange story of how a band that broke up in 1970 and never sold very many records at all have become a cottage industry with endless reissues and super deluxe reissues of their music. This is the story of the Velvet Underground after 1970. On the June 28th, I will be discussing Serge Gainsbourg, The Genius as Pervert. And on July the 5th, I will talk about the Second Vienna School. that is to say, of Schoenberg, Berg, and von Webern. So I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I appreciate it. If you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support this live stream, and I would really appreciate it at this time, given the circumstances under which I live. My PayPal account is Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donation to this live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.